Thank you, Eva. Nice to be with you, everyone. Well, Rob and Alex just gave a fantastic overview of the issues. So I don't think I need to go very deep into discussion about the problems with factory farming. I think that was pretty convincing what they showed. So I wanted to complement their presentation here and zoom in on a particular example. And I want to talk about African swine fever, which Rob already mentioned. Maybe next slide. So the African swine fever is it's a lethal disease for pigs. It's endemic to Africa and largely, by and large, stays there. But it has periodic moments where it's transported out of the country, or out of the continent, sorry, and ends up in other places. And as you can imagine, with the sort of chains of transmission that Rob and Alex were describing, this is something that we can imagine seeing more of. And the most recent incidence of this was in 2007, when the disease was detected in the Caucasus region in Georgia, particularly. And then now that strain is now called the Georgia 2007 strain. And from Georgia, it moved into Russia, then into Eastern Europe, gradually into China in 2018, and then from there throughout Asia. And this map is actually from early 2020. So there were some other countries, including India and Papua New Guinea, and even perhaps Thailand. There's a suspicion of it being there, present there, and Germany as well, although it's only in wild boars for the moment. And it's it's most of the damage has been in the last couple of years, and it's been overshadowed by the COVID pandemic. But the consequences of this disease are enormous. It's attacking in areas of both traditional small-scale pig raising and areas where you're seeing a large-scale expansion of factory farms and industrial pig production. And I think what I really appreciated about Alex and Rob's talk was just how they so carefully dismantled the dominant narratives that exist around disease. And this is something we think is also extremely important, because the narratives are used to entrench power and to expand, in fact, those industries that are driving these diseases and the emergence of new diseases. So let's just go and start in 2007. We'll go to the next slide, and we'll to the beginnings of when this latest epidemic of African swine fever emerged. So in the spring of 2007, farmers started noticing die-offs in high numbers of pigs from a mysterious disease. There were some reports of that in the newspapers, but it sort of went under the radar until July of that year, when samples were sent to a UK lab and turned out to be positive for African swine fever. And so you had immediately, experts from the European Union and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations were mobilized. There was a delegation of Swiss veterinary experts who were sent to Georgia. And their reporting was, that Georgia is ripe for a disaster here. Almost entirely all the pig farming is done on a very small scale, what they call backyard farms, or it's unconfined pigs, mostly local breeds, who roam into the forests and who scavenge. And there's almost no veterinary services. They also theorized that the disease had been brought in and through ship waste that was said to have been dumped around the port of Poti, and that scavenging pigs must have eaten that and then transmitted. So that was their theory, and it's a theory they use often. There was no proof for this, nor did they say anything at the time about the fact that one of the early outbreaks was in one of Georgia's few factory farms, and there could have been any possibilities of ASF coming in there, whether through feed or other sources. And then, of course, that farm being a major source of spread and transmission. But anyway, they did issue a bunch of recommendations. If you could go to the next slide. The Swiss team was particularly vocal. And all of the recommendations really just went after the small scale pig farmers. And they were very punitive, so they were saying, oh, the government should only provide compensation when the pigs were confined, to penalize farmers who aren't confining their pigs. That instead of paying farmers cash as compensation, they should give them these sort of industrial breeds of piglets to restock. They should issue prohibitions now on free roaming pigs, ensure all pigs are confined, and introduce a registration system along the lines of what you have in Western Europe. The FAO, similar, said keep backyard pigs permanently at home and in total confinement. Well, if you can go to the next slide. It's interesting because Georgia is really the only success story in this whole epidemic. And I think, it's never talked about that way by the experts. In fact, they completely ignore Georgia now, except when they talk about the strain. But if you look at what happened there, you just look at the characteristics of the response and the way the disease was managed in the country, I think it's important to highlight this. I mean, the disease management was left almost entirely in the hands of farmers because there was very little veterinary services to speak of. All that expert advice about confinement wasn't followed. Most of the factory farms shuttered. They ran out of business. There was an attempt to start a new one, and another outbreak happened, and that one closed down. There's no real much of an industry in terms of industrial meat processing. Most of it is done on a small scale and local. There aren't the same kind of regulations you see in Western Europe around small scale abattoirs. And after a year, there were no more reports of outbreaks. And a recent survey found no evidence of African swine fever circulating in the country. Next slide. Situation was dramatically different in southern Russia, north of the Georgian border. The initial cases there were around 2008, and it was mainly wild boar. I think there were perhaps one or two backyard farms, but there was no real, it was easily controlled, and there wasn't much of an outbreak. But things changed dramatically in 2009, 2010, when the disease got into some of the bigger factory farms. Now, this area of Russia was almost entirely, pig farming there was almost entirely in the hands of small, very small scale pig farmers. And in about the early 2000s, large agri-holding companies, many of them highly politically connected, as part of a national strategy, started buying up huge areas of land in this area, setting up large-scale feed production, feed mills, and then factory farms. So you really saw this almost like a colonization of that area by these large agri-holdings, most of them coming from other parts of Russia. And in that Krasnodar area, which is where many of these farms were concentrated, the outbreaks of African swine fever really got out of control very quickly. Within a couple of years, about 250,000 pigs were killed. There were also pigs dying on small scale farms, but to a much lesser extent. I mean, our numbers were about 250,000 on the factory farms and only 1,400 in outbreaks on small scale farms. But if you go to the next slide, contrary to what was done in Georgia, here in Russia, the expert advice was followed, and most of the measures just simply went after the small pig farms and were completely oriented around protecting these big agri-holdings and their factory farms. So you saw they instituted a culling policy where all pigs on small farms, whether they had diseases or not, or had ASF or not, were culled in a 5-kilometer radius around the farms. For Danish farms, and there are a lot of these Danish-owned farms in Eastern Europe, there was a special measure, so all small pigs on small farms in a 25-kilometer radius around the factory farms were culled. preemptive culls were instituted. So they would just cull the pigs of small-scale farmers to protect the big farms before the disease would even come into the area. Compensation was rare, if ever, for small-scale farms. And they began, and they've since now instituted this sort of system of compartmentalization, where essentially you sort of create a buffer zone for these factory farms. You stop all kind of small-scale production in the area, and you try to keep ASF out and then allow those companies to do this sort of closed vertically or vertically organized production so that they can continue to have export markets or markets in other parts of Russia. Next slide. And all of this was orchestrated very much by a collaboration of the big agri-holdings and the authorities. And the lobby from the agri-holdings was quite intense and was all directed at wiping out their main competition, was for the small-scale farmers. And this quote from Maxim Basov, who's the CEO of Rosagro, is pretty telling, but it wasn't uncommon. He said, the only way to reduce risks of ASF spreading is to ban the raising of pigs in small farms. You can go to the next slide. The consequences of these measures were a complete disaster. It has done nothing to stop the ASF epidemic, which continues to be a huge problem in Russia. From November 2020 to January 2021, over 500,000 pigs were killed in Russia. So that it's still it's actually worse than it was at this time in the early years. It's been an absolute disaster for small farmers. They used to produce about 70% of Russia's pork production. That was before the pandemic in 2005, or the epidemic in 2005. And now only 10% in 2020. Meanwhile, factory farm production has gone through the roof. A lot of foreign companies have come in and invested. You have financial companies invested as well. And Russia has become one of the top pork producers in the world and a major exporter. Next slide. And just to share one more quote here. Now, it's important to emphasize, I mean, if you remember in that southern part of Russia where all this began, and in other parts of Russia where it's continued, I mean, these are areas of traditional small-scale pig farming, where pig farming is a major part of the culture and people's livelihoods and the rural economies. And these companies have come in and completely colonized these areas and then introduced this disease, which has wiped out so much of small-scale production, not only from the disease, but from the measures themselves. And then the arrogance and the callousness of these executives, this guy, Sergei Yushin, who's the CEO of the main lobby group for Russia's big meat companies. He says, he was asked about ASF, and he was pointing the finger at backyard farmers, and he said, well, there are still remote villages located many kilometers away from production facilities where people still raise pigs for sale of their own consumption. So the backyard farms will not die out completely. We hope, though, that there will be at least some control, because now it is a complete mess. Their pigs are free to run in the woods and mate with wild pigs, increasing epizootic risks. As if these few remaining and marginalized now small farms have anything to do with the massive scale of the outbreak that continues to go on in Russia. Next slide, please. So, of course, when the disease got into Russia, the other European countries are very concerned about it coming there. A lot goes into trying to ensure that doesn't happen, but the experts are all focused on backyard farms. And that's if you look at the publications from that time and the policies that come out, everything is about how to control backyard farms. And the FAO, which is tasked with supporting small farmers, they recommended that small farms in Ukraine simply stop raising pigs. I mean, pig farming in Ukraine for small farmers is a hugely important thing and goes back generations and generations. And in the FAO just, offhand recommends that they just stop farming pigs as a way to deal with this, effectively manage this disease. And there was some truth to this in the sense that, yes, and on the borders with Russia, there are wild boars who were carrying ASF and who did transmit it to some backyard farms. But if you look at all the countries, those initial outbreaks were effectively dealt with. And it only happens, and that can be sometimes a year, 2 years, 3 years afterwards, when the disease gets into a large scale facility, that things explode and you get these mass out of control outbreaks throughout the countries of Eastern Europe. Next slide. Ukraine is a good example. The FAO and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is a huge financier of factory farming in Eastern Europe, investment in factory farming in Eastern Europe. They launched their ASF risk mitigation initiative with Japanese funding in January 2015, and their focus was on the pig-producing regions of Poltava and Kiev. But half a year later, ASF is detected in carcasses that had actually been shipped 2 weeks prior from one of the largest pig farming complexes in Kiev. So it traveled a long way. And this farming complex is mainly a fattening farm, had over 62,000 pigs that were affected and culled on the farm. It had a feed mill operation. So the disease was being generated and being transmitted in multiple pathways coming out of that farm for weeks before it was detected. And there was some reports of it violating biosafety protocols, whatever that means. But the bottom line is that it was that triggered the explosion across the country, and the disease is still circulating widely in Ukraine and causing all kinds of problems. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight the role of Danish farms in this, as the Danish companies have been at the forefront of expanding factory farms into Eastern Europe, including Russia. With funding from their own development bank, they advertise themselves as the putting in place the top biosecurity and the most high-tech operations. There's a lot of resistance to these farms because they generate tremendous amounts of pollution, of course, all kinds of other problems. But they fight their communities and get the support of politicians and put these farms in place. Now, despite their assurances of having the best biosecurity, African swine fever ripped through their operations. There's a list of some of the outbreaks here, but we calculated that between 2016 and 2019, when it was really heavily circulating, disease was really heavily circulating in Eastern Europe, that these Danish farms accounted for nearly a quarter of all the pig deaths that were reported to the World Animal Health Organization during that time. So the most sort of so-called modern farms with all this financial investment are actually driving much of the disease explosions and transmissions. If we can go to the next slide. And here too, Eastern Europe follows the Russian model. Belarus passes a law to imprison small farmers if their pigs are infected with African swine fever. Used to have the same sort of preemptive culls and all this regulations to force farmers to confine their pigs. The compensation isn't given unless people meet the comply with EU regulations, and for small farmers that's simply impossible. And there was quite a bit of farmer resistance. Going back to Alex's point about conflict, farmers were pushing back, but it's a very powerful industry and very difficult to do so. And there you see a protest by Polish farmers, but there was like militias that were organized by farmers in Romania to defend their pigs. But despite all that, it's been a real devastating time for small pig farmers in Eastern Europe. And I just give one example of how in the Ukraine, pig production on small farms has decreased by about a third. So this is a major blow, and it's hard to know if it will ever recover. Next slide. Things get even more out of hand when African swine fever moves to China, which is accounts for 50%, I think, of all pork production in the world. And it was sort of known that this would eventually happen. It did happen in the northeast part of China. So people talked about how this must have kind of spilled over from the Russian border. But to me, that's not really the most important part of the story here. That region of China had been, for the last decade or so, in the focus of a national program to move pig production northwards. And there was a lot of facilities and subsidies and others given to the largest pig companies, including foreign companies, to set up feed mills, infrastructure, large-scale factory farms, pig breeding operations in the north. And that was largely because in the south it was completely over. There was just the production was overwhelming, and the pollution concerns were getting to the point where they felt they had to move production northwards. So you had a situation where you have all these, and as Rob was saying, that all these pathways for transmission, and the local authorities have absolutely no capacity to deal with the risks from these kinds of operations that have been constructed in their areas. As the disease just rips through the countryside and through these operations, they just sort of fold, and there's really nothing done. The numbers of dead animals are not even counted. I mean, the official numbers it was 1.2 million pigs killed, but it's well known that it was well over 200 million. I mean, even Chinese authorities will admit that. This is a country where, again, like Eastern Europe, but even more so, I mean, pig farming is so central to the culture and the economies of rural China, and you have pigs just completely wiped out in much of the countryside. Go to the next slide, please. So yeah, I don't want to go over this because Rob and Alex have already talked about how factory farms are so instrumental in spreading diseases and the development of new diseases. But just to say that one thing that was I think has now been a bit more accepted in the story of disease transmission amongst animals is how feed plays a role. Commercial feeds play a role in this. I mean, the authorities will always talk about swill feed or like household waste as being an important part of transmission, but really it's the commercial feeds that seem to play such a huge role in Eastern Europe and in Asia in spreading the disease. In China, for instance, and this is not just common to China, it's common elsewhere in the global meat industry, but they use the blood from the slaughterhouses as a feed source. And that was recognized as a source of transmission. There was actually a measure put in place by the Chinese government to ban it, which was quickly rescinded after lobby pressure from the companies. But that is known as a factor of transmission. And it's important to highlight that because this is something that the FAO and so many other agencies and governments have been promoting so heavily to small farmers and pushing them to start using commercial feeds. Even Bill and Melinda Gates foundations and others who say this, this is the way to achieve high yields and modernize your farms. And then, to understand that this is such a high risk and that you're actually setting the stage for not only transmission of disease, but for wiping out your chances of pig farming completely. I think it's a really something really important to always be aware of and speak loudly about. The next slide. Yeah, just to say that it's from China, because of all of these chains of transmission that have already been described, you just see the ASF take off, and it moves into Vietnam, it moves into Korea, and it just goes, it continues to spread from there. Wild boars weren't the major source of transmission. Of course, they get a lot of attention, but it was through feed, it was through the movement of piglets and pigs and trucks coming in and out of the people's operations. And those who are most devastated by this, I'd say, are the small commercial farms, or the contract growers. As Rob was describing, those who've been really lured into or forced into sometimes into these contract growing operations where they take on a considerable debt and take on all the risks. And they'll put in place all the biosecurity measures that the veterinarians and the companies tell them to do. And it's just nowhere near enough to stop the diseases coming from in. And we saw this with bird flu, and it's the same thing here with African swine fever, where they were these farms were just completely wiped out, and many of them will never be able to get back into pig farming. So this whole notion of modernization is really, it's a ruse, and it's deadly for small farmers. The industry needs them, so there'll be enough room for some to maintain and work in these stressful, debt-laden lives. But what we're seeing too is a move to more larger and larger, more industrialized operations. Go to the next slide. In China, what happened was with the ASF and how it just so completely wiped out production, the prices went through the roof for pork locally. And the government did everything it could to provide companies with compensation. They also had access to insurance, subsidies. The government pulled back on regulations, loosened regulations around the environment. They started, a lot of these companies were experimenting with vaccines too, which were sort of under the table vaccines, which seemed to have led to the emergence of new variants. And you get money from development banks and pension funds and all other sources of finance, right? So like Muyan Foods, which is building this, another one of these big pig hotels, although this one is going to be the largest one in the world in Henan province, is getting money from a World Bank agribusiness recovery program. So, millions of dollars for agribusiness to build this kind of operation, which is seen now as the future of pig production in China. So they had the advantage in terms of restocking quickly, and they made billions in this, and also through imports. So it generated a surge of imports into China, and those corporations who had these global networks, who were actively participating in the transmission of diseases, become the ones who can profit most from this situation. The next slide. One of those companies is Smithfield, or the WH Group. Its parent company is WH Group in China. That whole merger of WH Group and Smithfield was orchestrated by some of the Wall Street financial companies. And BlackRock and others continued to be major shareholders in the company. But this is a company with a deep and long history of being at the center of disease outbreaks, and they recognize it as a moment for profit. Their Smithfield CEO said this quite candidly to Bloomberg at one point. So they recognize it as a situation for profit. And they were very much central again in the outbreaks with ASF. They had a factory farm in Poland, in Western Poland, that was the first commercial farm to be affected in Western Poland. In Northeast China, one of their industrial meat plants, which had been set up in Northeast China, and was pulling in pigs from hundreds of kilometers away, was one of the first places identified with the ASF in China. And so it's, you can just imagine what role that operation played in spreading the disease. And even months after, like for instance, in this picture of these processed sausages here that were found and confiscated at Taiwan airport, they were still shipping out infected meat months after that initial detection. And it was boom time for WH Group. In the year of 2019, so when the ASF outbreak was at its height in China, WH Group made $1.4 billion in profits. They announced this in March 2020. They also announced at that time a $600 million dividend payout, which is a record for the company, to their owner, executives, and the shareholder. And it's important to note that the timing of that, because that's when they also found out about an outbreak where they got the first indication that COVID was present in their meat plant facility in Sioux Falls, North Dakota. Sorry, maybe South Dakota. Anyway, Sioux Falls, there's Sioux Falls plant in the US. And the company put a priority on maintaining its exports to China because they were so lucrative. It did this also with operations in Europe, but where they would keep a double shift going. They really put heavily pressure on their workers to remain on the job. and to pump out these exports. And within a couple months, 1,300 workers were infected with COVID. 4 workers died. I mean, there's nobody keeping track of how many other people who connected to these workers got sick or who perished. But it was, very much connected to this whole way that the companies profit off of diseases, and even directly to the ASF outbreak in China. And since then, the company has been just deplorable when it comes to recognizing the sacrifice that its workers made. And there's now a strike action plan at the plant because the company is refusing to negotiate a new contract, and is even wanting to cut back on the eliminate the second 15-minute break that workers are given in a day. Next slide. So Alex has talked brilliantly about what can be done, and so I don't need to say much about that. But I just wanted to emphasize that, we're in a situation where all the government authorities and the international agencies are focused on a model of biosecurity that is built around the vulnerability of these large-scale operations, factory farms and industrial meat processing plants. So it's built around this completely high-risk, deadly scenario, whereas small farms and local food systems are not high risk. They don't have the same kind of risk. There aren't the same kind of needs that you need for biosecurity when it comes to these commercial operations. And there are very effective ways that could be implemented to deal with African swine fever. I mean, Georgia dealt with it without any resources or help. The Georgian farmers did. So you can imagine if there was some kind of resources and help that was, adapted to their needs and that was put in place, and what could be done. And this is the case also in other countries. And we have a report from last year that highlights this. So I think, the most important thing in thinking about alternatives is really just to stop factory farming. I mean, it's not necessary. It's only there to serve the profits of those who own the companies and the financial firms that own stock in these companies. All in the same way, I think there's no need for the surplus production, the export production of industrial meat. This is, part and parcel of that biosecurity, is that you need to have this tight biosecurity in order to maintain your exports, and so everything is focused on that. And really, because of climate change, we need to move towards moderate consumption of meat anyways. And in moving towards moderate consumption, we have to think about, well, what's equitable in terms of production? If we're going to put, a sort of cap on the consumption that people are allowed, and can move back towards, calm things down, move away from this intensive models of production. Well, how can we do so equitably? How can we make sure that the maximum number of livelihoods are sustained, and how this can be rich for people's culture and for rural communities. And and lastly, just to say, the focus needs to be on animal and human health. And as we've seen, the health of animals and humans in these operations is really the last consideration, and it's done just as a way to deal with all the risks they generate, instead of trying to develop systems where that is at first and foremost, a major priority.